Good morning. Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to provide this testimony. My name is Kat Packer. I currently serve as the Director of Drug Markets and Legal Regulation for the Drug Policy Alliance, and had the opportunity to serve as the first Executive Director for the City of L.A.'s Department of Cannabis Regulation. That may make me the only person in the room that has personal experience leading a regulatory medical and adult use cannabis program and have direct experience implementing and managing a cannabis social equity and jobs program. I've spent the last 8.5 years working on cannabis policy reform with an eye towards making sure that we prioritize social equity, and was very proud to be able to come back home to Ohio and support adult use legalization here, in part because the legalization initiative, issue 2, while imperfect, did center around criminal justice reform and equity. My concern, and I'll use a pun here, I know this is a very serious matter, but we use puns in the cannabis space. But my concern is that through some of the reforms that I'm seeing being introduced in this legislature, we would be moving from puff, puff, pass to puff, puff, police. And that is in total contradiction to what Ohio voters voted in support of. I'll start with the more direct puff, puff, pass, passing, sharing. This concept of adults being able to share cannabis is critical to cannabis policy reform across the country. I spent some time, probably stayed up until about 3 o'clock this morning, just doing some research so that I could give you all the specifics, but did research on the other 23 states that have passed adult use cannabis. And I'll ask, does anybody have any idea of how many of those states criminalize sharing of the 23? 0. But more importantly than what the other 23 states did, Ohio voters passed issue 2, which allowed for sharing. And I think it would be, again, in total contradiction to criminalize what Ohio voters have decided that they want to do, and it would put Ohio as an outlier for a reason I really can't seem to fathom. Another kind of idea of this puff puff police agenda. Ohio voters could have chosen to pass a initiative that dedicated resources explicitly to law enforcement. They chose not to. I've heard members of this body and members of the legislature generally talk about how maybe Ohio voters didn't know exactly what they were voting for, but I disagree. I think that Ohio voters did know what they were voting for. They had an opportunity to review what the tax rate was and what they were spending their taxes on. And Ohio voters decided that they wanted to put money towards a cannabis social equity and jobs fund. Unfortunately, some of the legislation that's been introduced would dedicate a significant amount of money towards law enforcement. Now, I recognize that folks may feel as though law enforcement has a responsibility in managing some of these cannabis activities, but I have to tell you that as the shift is happening across the country, law enforcement is stepping back and regulators are stepping forward. These are resources that agencies outside of traditional law enforcement need resources for. I can tell you, even when I was with the City of Los Angeles, I was essentially part of the mayor's cabinet and sat directly with the police chief, and he articulated to me that they wanted to get out of the cannabis business, that they would love to be able to pass this responsibility to another agency so that they could focus on issues that were of higher priority. Creating and increasing new taxes not only would make it more difficult for consumers to transition and participate into adult use cannabis, but I can't imagine that Ohio voters imagine that every single time they spent money on cannabis, they would be funding law enforcement or the exact type of criminalization that many Ohio voters were trying to reform and step away from. I have specific concerns about efforts to dilute language around the Cannabis Social Equity and Jobs Program. The initiative itself articulated that the money that was supposed to be dedicated to this program would be used for no other purpose. And now there's language in House Bill 354 that would allow these funds to be used for, and I quote, any other purpose, for things like economic development, community engagement, social development. These are things that actually arguably could be spent on law enforcement. I would strongly encourage folks to strike out that language that would allow the money specifically that was supposed to be dedicated towards the Cannabis Jobs and Social Equity Program to be used for quote unquote any other purpose. In the same vein, maybe not surprisingly, even the substance abuse funding that was dedicated in this measure is somehow being routed towards law enforcement. In fact, under House Bill 354, the only money that would be dedicated towards substance abuse, the only way that you'd be able to tap into those funds is if you got those funds and had programs and services in jail. I also just want to note, it seems like there's this intention to, maybe as a means to allow folks to transition more directly into the legal market, an idea to allow folks to have expedited access, essentially allowing the medical operators to have automatic and expedited access to participate in adult use sales. And I would just caution that many other states, as they've particularly tried to launch their equity programs, have learned that there's significant first mover advantage that can be given to these medical operators. And while I recognize that folks may want to bring on adult use consumers, that may be a short-term goal and may not consider this long-term strategy of making sure that this is an economic opportunity, not just for the haves, but the have-nots. And I have concern about this simultaneous idea of allowing existing medical operators to have immediate access to adult use, while simultaneously there are these efforts to redirect money towards law enforcement and away from the Cannabis Social Equity and Jobs program. I was told when I was a regulator in the City of Los Angeles that I should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, and I know that this legislature can do the same. We can move forward with an adult use program here in the state of Ohio that is responsible and that is equitable. But if we turn this cannabis policy reform into a puff police agenda, we are not acting with the intent, integrity of the voters. You all would be doing something that is seemingly of your own priorities. So my ask is that any types of policy shifts here in the state of Ohio around cannabis policy reform keep equity and fairness at its center, that we ensure that funding that's dedicated to cannabis social equity remains, and that we think very critically about whether or not voters wanted to dedicate money to law enforcement. And if we are going to dedicate money to law enforcement, then I think it's increasingly important that we put parameters around this funding to ensure that we are not funding the same types of harms and disparities that motivated voters to go out to the polls and support this type of reform. I appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony to you today and can answer any questions that you all may have.